And so what are some of the pros and cons? Because I'm sure this is going to come up, and I want to hear your guys' thoughts. Some of the pros are, you bolster your financial strength in this environment, which is kind of nice. You can reduce your costs through economies of scale, and you can buy expensive technology that you couldn't otherwise buy. And if you do things right, and you partner with the right firm that shares your core values, and you set up a clinically integrated network with clinical protocols and guidelines, you can actually improve quality. But some of the concerns are that this would actually worsen quality. And I can see where that can happen with the wrong deal. There are some concerns at the business of medicine. There are some ethical concerns there. And then there are concerns also that this would increase the cost because now you have these bigger groups that are demanding higher premiums or payments. And some of the concerns of the physicians I've talked to is just loss of control. And so, I look at it like this. This isn't for all doctors, but it would be nice to have a cash infusion to help you grow and remain sustainable in this ever-changing healthcare environment. This is like, do you sell your house now because the market is hot, or do you wait until the market crashes? We often don't have opportunities to monetize our practices. Orthopedic surgeons or physicians in general tend to, I think what Oren said, or someone is, they just kind of walk away. One option is to make a deal like this before you do that. And the future of healthcare is somewhat uncertain with regulation and with reimbursement. Who knows where things are going to go? And it's not that you're just, getting a cash out and then jumping ship, but you're getting in a position where you can be more competitive and more sustainable because you've got the support financially. And one of the things that I've learned doing this is you basically get to choose who you partner with and design your own transaction. So if you have a firm that shares your core values, understands your mission and vision for your practice, for your patients, for your community, then that's the deal that you should look at. And so I want to introduce Joe from Intrepid. I want to thank him for coming all the way out here. I met Joe a few years ago, but we've not done any business together. Joe was someone who offered to do this after the person that we had didn't show up. So Joe is based in Los Angeles with a firm called Intrepid. He has extensive experience advising entrepreneurs. His focus is on a broad range of healthcare service sectors, and he is a thought leader in the ortho space, and I would like to have him share what he thinks goes into a deal based on his experience, and then answer some tough questions from the audience. Thank you. Yeah. Forward and back. And disregard that.
All right. All right. Thank you, Ray. So as Ray introduced me, my name is Joe Wisniewski. I'm a vice president with Intrepid Investment Bankers. We're an investment bank based in Los Angeles, California. Essentially what that means is we work with physician entrepreneurs that are looking to raise capital or pursue a sale, whether that's to a strategic acquirer like a health system or partner with a private equity firm and maintain some level of ownership going forward. So Ray and I, like he mentioned, we've known each other for a few years. And go even just a few years ago, the landscape of private equity within orthopedics looked very different than it does today. So I'm interested in kind of a show of hands, who in the room has either heard of private equity or knows colleagues that have gone through a transaction or at least had these types of conversations. So it looks like at least 50, 60%. And I think that's pretty impressive given that this has really only been going on now, kind of, I'd say this time around. I know there was different investments 20, 30 years ago with a very different structure. But given that this has been around for 4 or 5 years, and it's folks are really starting to talk about it today, and you're seeing increased activity across the country. So I know Ray gave an overview of what private equity is. I'm happy to answer specific questions if there are after this presentation, and I'll try to move fairly quickly so we can get to Q&A if there's any questions on any of these topics. But let me see here. Oh, this one, okay. There we go. So, but end of 2019, right before COVID, if you looked at the country, this is the landscape of orthopedic practices that had partnered with a private equity firm. So I believe there's about 7 practices here, different types of groups clinically, different geographies, but the simpler sentiment with a private equity firm coming in, acquiring ownership in the practice, and looking to grow through building out new locations, hiring new physicians, making acquisitions in their existing and also new geographies. And so this is what the landscape looked like just over 3 years ago. And now this is what it looks like today. So this is what's happened really in the last 3 years amidst COVID shutdowns and managing the dynamics over the last couple of years. So I think there's 16 groups listed here. There's a couple others that aren't publicly announced that I wasn't able to put on here. But since 2016, where the Core Institute in Arizona first partnered with an investment firm to build out their MSO, groups around the country have taken notice and looked at this as an opportunity for them. So this slide there's a lot here, but really what I wanted to touch on is what does it really mean to do a private equity deal, and what does that structure look like? So at a very high level, if you assume a practice has, let's just say, $100 million of practice collections or revenue, and the partners in the practice earn $40 million a year of compensation. So that's 40% of collections. If you were to what we call normalize those that compensation down to 30% of the revenue or 30 million, the difference between the 30 and the 40 million, that 10 million of earnings, is left in the business going forward. So basically, as a shareholder physician in an orthopedics practice, when you pursue an orthopedic or a private equity deal, you end up lowering your compensation as a percentage of what you produce, but you are keeping that in the business as earnings or profitability. And the term that we use in the deal business is EBITDA. That's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Basically, all you need to know is it's a proxy for the cash flow in the business. And so a private equity firm is looking at your practice and looking at what it looks like on what's called a normalized basis or pro forma, understanding that post-transaction there would be earnings or profitability left in the business through a reduced compensation. And then to get to the valuation of the practice, they pay a multiple on that EBITDA. So this example here assumes $100 million enterprise value, which in that example would be the example I gave before. Basically, if you were to normalize your 40 million of compensation across the shareholders to 30 million, that leaves 10 million of profit at a 10 times multiple, 10 times the 10 million of earnings or EBITDA, you get a $100 million valuation. And so taking that example, the chart on the left here kind of shows how the capitalization of the business would look day one in a transaction. So from the bottom up, the rollover equity, 21 out of the 100, and again, this is illustrative and basically, a case study here, but that 21 million of rollover equity is continued ownership from the original shareholder physicians. The 49 million here is new equity investment money, so that's the private equity firm's cash that they're putting into the investment. And then this 30 million is debt. It's bank debt and other forms of debt that they would use to invest on a leverage basis. Now, this might sound like a lot of debt on a business, but when you're doing $10 million of profitability per year, you can service this debt fairly comfortably. But what this does is it allows the business that cash flow to pay down the debt, use the cash flow to go out and acquire new locations, make investments into new service lines, bring on new physicians, ultimately growing the EBITDA, that earnings base. And as you grow, in 3, 4, 5 years down the road, when that private equity firm is ready to sell to another private equity firm, which is typically how these partnerships end, with them selling to typically a larger private equity firm as the practice grows, you have a multiple on that larger EBITDA base, and you've by that point paid down the debt, and most of that capitalization is equity. The other thing I'll mention here, this orange box in the bottom right corner, the management options. One of the things that private equity firms really want to do is partner with practices with really strong management teams. Now, that doesn't mean every practice that pursues a private equity deal needs to have a CEO or even needs to have a CFO or a financial resource, because those practices, if you have a really good clinical operation but not a strong back office, you can be a really good add-on acquisition for a business that's in the space. But basically what I'm showing here is that private equity really wants to incentivize the administrators and the leadership team of these practices, because we'll touch on this a bit later. Really, the idea here is to build out the management services and have a really strong, sustainable business to support the clinical footprint. I know there's a lot here. I know this might be confusing, but I can answer questions after or offline as well. So the reason that economics make sense for the private equity firms and for the physicians in these practice deals is, as the company grows, that multiple or the valuation multiple that's paid on the earnings, it tends to increase based on the scale and the infrastructure of the company. So this visual here, let's say the platform on the left in light blue is purchased at a 10 times multiple. If you go out and acquire 4 other practices that may not have the administrative infrastructure at a 6 times multiple and bring them under the broader management services umbrella of the platform, when you exit, the platform multiple, given those scale and the track record of being able to acquire other practices, will often increase. So in this example, let's say the platform on the left was 10 times, you acquire these other businesses for 5 or 6 times EBITDA, and the larger organization is now worth 12 times. And so for the partners that were in the business from day one, your equity has appreciated alongside that growth. And then for the add-on acquisitions along the way, your equity that's in the broader practice also appreciates alongside that equity appreciation. So it tends to be a win-win economically for both the investment firm, which is their goal is to generate a return on their investment, but also for physicians that want to build the equity value a bit faster than they would if they were to remain independent. So this is a visual of this MSO or managed services organization that Ray touched on. The idea here is to basically institutionalize the practice in a way that the business side of the business is efficient, scalable, and it helps the clinical side be more effective. So when you think of an MSO, this is CFO, CEO, HR department, IT. You may build out your own software infrastructure, billing and collections, having that in-house. And then as you scale, leverage with payers and things like that. That is the business side of this that supports, on the right side, the clinical operations. And that's everything you do clinically, that's seeing patients in the clinic, that's building out ASCs, bringing on ancillary services, opening urgent care centers, however you grow clinically. And as you grow clinically, the management services supports that. And as you go out and build out a presence in new geographies or make acquisitions of smaller practices, that management services piece supports the broader footprint. And that's not just in a given geography. What you'll see, and I'll talk to this at a future slide, but some of these groups, they don't just look in a certain market. Some do, but some will look, they'll acquire a platform in a given geography and then build out this MSO that supports a national presence in multiple states. And so this is kind of where I can speak to that. Going from left to right here, this is an example of 3 of those 16 private equity partnerships that have taken place in the orthopedic space. So on the left, this is the first partnership. This was back in 2016. This is the Core Institute in Arizona and Michigan. And their initial deal was a little bit different from what you see in the later transactions, but basically they partnered with a private equity firm, Fraser Healthcare Partners, who helped build out the software and the management services back office for them. And then they essentially went to market with that product. And they've been adding on to this business with smaller practices that don't have the infrastructure in place. So their strategy has looked slightly different from others, but it's very much focused on that MSO that they've built out. The middle group here, Orthopedic Care Partners. This was a transaction that first took place in 2019. This is a business, the Orthopedic Institute in Gainesville, Florida. At the time, the Orthopedic Institute had about 20 physicians, full suite of ancillaries, and they partnered with Varsity Healthcare Partners, who had actually done this very similar strategy in the ophthalmology space, building what is now ESP, one of the largest eye care platforms in the country. But basically what they've done is gone out and find leading regional platforms across the country. So they partnered with the Stedman Clinic in Colorado, partnered with Motion Orthopedics in Missouri, and so now they have a 4-state platform, and they've been in this investment now for going on 4 years. So they're at a stage today where they've doubled, tripled, quadrupled the earnings base, that EBITDA, and are looking, I'd say over the next 12 to 18 months, I'd expect to see them, Varsity, sell to another private equity firm, to a newer or larger private equity firm, to continue that growth. And the last group here, Spire Orthopedic Partners. This was a business in Greenwich, Connecticut, orthoneurosurgeons, ONS, comprehensive ortho neuro services. They're hyper-focused in the Connecticut and New York region. So they're not looking to move into Florida and Colorado and things like that. They're going deep within in that Northeast market and really want to build out regional density. So this is kind of a taste of the three of the different strategies that these investment firms are bringing to the market. In terms of the valuation, I know I kind of, when I gave the example earlier of the capitalization structure, I mentioned 10 times EBITDA, and I'm sure many of you have heard EBITDA multiples thrown around and folks saying, I'm an 8 times practice or I'm an 11 times practice, but what does that really mean? And there's a lot of factors that go into the multiple. There's a lot of factors that just go into the calculation of EBITDA and understanding what you can add back in terms of personal or non-recurring expenses and things like that. But specifically related to that multiple, the multiple represents it's a basis to represent the valuation, but there's a lot more that goes into it around kind of the discounted cash flows of the business going forward and those types of financial models that the private equity firms will build. But from a very high level, this is, I tried to put this together to show generally the things and attributes of within your practice that could drive the multiple one way or another. So I think it comes down to three main things. One, it's size and scale. So the more physicians you have, the more locations, the higher the multiple. It's the diversification, so or implied stability in the earnings base. So more geographies, more service lines, more subspecialties. The more diversified, if you're in different states, there's less diversification with payers and things like that. So the more diversification. And then lastly, growth. So if you're growing 10, 15, 20% a year, and you can show a consistent track record of growth, that's going to help drive the multiple as well. So there's a lot on this slide. I'd say the biggest thing to understand as it relates to specifically the private equity transaction is it's kind of a midpoint between remaining completely independent and keeping 100% ownership of the business and selling 100% of the practice to a hospital. And so you keep anywhere from 60 to 80% of the equity amongst your partners, and maintain a board seat, maintain involvement on both the business side, and obviously maintain oversight on the clinical side. So I'm sure many of you in this room are getting calls from private equity firms directly, or other other orthopedic physicians from residency, or friends that are in the industry that have already done a deal, and they're saying, we have a great group, you should come join us, things like that. And so we often get questions at Intrepid of, how do I even approach this? Do I just take this call and share financials, and where do I go from there? So the way that basically what we do at Intrepid with my firm is we're an investment banking advisor. So we help you build the transaction team and then structure a process where we build out the offering memorandum and the financial model to go out to market to have these conversations with the private equity firms, with hospitals, with any potential capital partner that based on your situation. And so there's a few key things you want to build. It's other than having an advisor on the investment banking side, you need really good M&A counsel, and then you need an accounting firm, a CPA firm that does what's called a quality of earnings analysis. It's like an audit, but more focused on the trends in the business, less of a balance sheet focus like an audit. And then tax advisors, estate planners. It's always good to have those conversations early, 6, 12 months at least, ahead of closing a transaction, because there's some things that you can do that you have to do earlier. But basically, you build out your team, you get ready, and then you start to have these conversations. And that process, start to finish, takes once you're picking up the phone and having these conversations with folks, it takes 6 to 9 months. So this isn't something that happens overnight. It takes time, and throughout that process, you get the chance to meet with all of the groups that are considering these types of partnerships. You get to spend time with them, dinners, meetings, understand where they're coming from clinically, what their goals are, how they think about growth. And what you often find is they're very different. I know I touched on a few of the different strategies here, but culturally, they're just very different situations and opportunities. And so the last thing I'll mention here, and I know Ray touched on, you don't want to sell your do you want to sell your house in a hot market or wait till the market crashes? There's various timing considerations as it relates to these partnerships and transactions. There's both external and internal. So externally, yes, the market right now is really attractive from an economics perspective. Interest rates are very low. There's trillions of dollars of private equity capital chasing after attractive investment vehicles or assets within healthcare, and valuations are good. And as you saw on the page, there's 16 platforms in orthopedics today. So if you as a shareholder in your practice want to go to market and have these conversations, there's 16 folks that are going to be at the table, and it's going to be a very competitive environment. So that externally, that's great. But internally within your organization, just because the market's good doesn't mean that it's the right time for you to pursue these types of conversations. It's always a balancing act between going too early and leaving money on the table versus waiting too long and then not having enough exciting growth ahead of you. So, these are the types of conversations we're having every day around, what can I do? For us, it's not necessarily what can I do over the next, 3-4 months to get ready for this. It's, I want to do this in 5 years. What can I do today to, build out my, organization and build out my team, add new locations, add providers, and things like that. So that's just kind of a final note on timing. Just because you're hearing a lot about this, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right for you right now, or it may never be. This is not something that's necessarily for every physician practice, but for those that embark on this process, I think it can be pretty rewarding. That's all I have here. Do we have any questions?